It was a slow evening for Mr. Thomas. Sitting in his modest living room, he scrolled through his Facebook notifications absent-mindedly, yawning as he glanced at the time, 6:47 p.m. His phone buzzed again, a new message appearing in his inbox. Siganadigan, Thomas, my brother, it's been ages. I'm in town for a few days. Let's meet up for drinks. There's a quiet bar not far from you. What do you say? Thomas squinted at the name. Siganadigan. The name rang a bell. His mind traveled back to his teenage years, to a dusty classroom filled with restless boys in green and white uniforms. He remembered Segun, the tall, energetic guy who always had a mischievous grin, the one who could sweet-talk his way out of trouble with teachers. After secondary school, they had gone their separate ways. Thomas had pursued business administration at the University of Lagos, struggled through odd jobs, and finally settled as a modest transport company manager. He had a wife, 2 children, and a quiet life. But Sigan? He had no idea what had become of him. A nostalgic smile crept onto Thomas's face. After all these years, he thought. Without hesitation, he typed back, Sigan, my guy, it's really been long. Of course, let's meet up. Send me the location. Almost instantly, Sigan replied with the name of a small bar, the Haven Lounge, just a few streets away from Thomas' home. Sigan, 8 p.m., brother. First round is on me. Thomas chuckled and shook his head. The thought of catching up over drinks with an old friend excited him. He could already picture them laughing over old memories, dodging prefects, sneaking out of school to watch football, and their teenage crushes. He looked at his wife, Linda, who sat beside him watching a reality TV show. Honey, one of my secondary school friends just messaged me out of the blue. We haven't seen each other in over 20 years. He invited me for drinks at a quiet place. Should I go? Linda glanced at him, unimpressed. This your secondary school friend, where has he been all these years? Thomas shrugged. I don't know, but he sounded really excited to see me. We used to be close back then. Linda sighed. Just be careful. These days you don't know who is who anymore. If you must go, don't stay out too late. Yes, madam, Thomas teased, standing up and stretching. I won't be long. Maybe just an hour or 2. Linda shook her head. That's what you always say. Thomas laughed and went to freshen up. By 7:50 p.m., he was on his way. The streets were dimly lit, the night air cool against his skin as he walked towards the bar. It was a modest place, not too crowded, just as Sigun had described. A few small tables lined the corners, soft jazz music playing in the background. Thomas stepped inside and looked around. And then he saw him. Sitting at a corner table, a glass of whiskey in hand, was Sigun Adigan. But something was different. The mischievous schoolboy was gone. The man sitting there now had a polished but hardened look. He wore a crisp navy blue shirt with the sleeves folded up to reveal a gold wristwatch. His beard was neatly trimmed, and his eyes, those eyes had a certain sharpness to them, like a man who had seen too much of the world. Yet when he looked up and saw Thomas, his face lit up in a broad grin. Thomas! Sigun stood up, arms open wide. My guy! Sigun! Thomas grinned, walking forward. They hugged briefly before sitting down. Sigun. Thomas grinned, walking forward. They hugged briefly before sitting down. You haven't changed much, Sigun said, studying him. Still the same serious face. And you, Thomas chuckled. You look like money, Sigun laughed. We thank God. You know the hustle never stops. He signaled the waiter. What are you drinking? Just a bottle of beer, Thomas said, still smiling. The waiter nodded and left. So tell me, Sigun leaned forward, what have you been up to all these years? Thomas exhaled. My brother, life has been lifing. After university, I did a few jobs here and there, then started working with a transport company. I'm now a manager. Married, 2 kids, normal life. Sigun nodded, taking a slow sip of his whiskey. Nice. Family man. Responsible. That's good. Thomas chuckled. And you? What are you into now? Sigun smiled, but it was the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. Me? I do business. Import, export, travels, logistics. A bit of everything. Thomas raised an eyebrow. That sounds vague. Sigun laughed. You know how business is. The less details you give, the smoother it runs. The waiter returned with Thomas' drink, and the 2 men toasted. To old times, Sigun said. To old times, Thomas echoed. They drank, reminiscing about their school days. How Sigun once tricked a teacher into thinking he was sick just to skip an exam. How Thomas had a secret crush on their English teacher, Miss Joy. Time flew as they laughed and talked. But as Thomas took another sip of his beer, something about Segun's presence began to feel off. He noticed how Segun's eyes darted around the room every few minutes, how he checked his phone constantly, how his fingers drummed impatiently on the table. It was as if he was waiting for something or someone. Thomas frowned. "You seem distracted. Are you expecting someone?" Segun paused, then gave another one of those unreadable smiles. "Just some business associates. But let's not talk about that. This night is about us." Thomas nodded slowly, but a strange feeling crept into his stomach. Something wasn't right. Outside the bar, a sleek black car pulled up quietly, its tinted windows rolling down slightly. Two men sat inside, watching. Segun took another sip of his drink, his smile never faltering. "Tell me, Thomas," he said smoothly, "are you a man who likes opportunities?" Thomas raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Segun leaned in slightly, the kind of opportunity that changes lives forever. Thomas hesitated, not liking the way Segun's voice had dropped to a lower, more serious tone. "Segun," he said slowly, "what exactly do you do?" Segun swirled the ice in his glass and chuckled. "My brother," he said, "I make people very useful." And for the first time that night, Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. Thomas tried to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping over him, but it clung to him like an unseen hand on his shoulder. Segun had always been charismatic, but there was something different about him now, something polished yet predatory. Segun must have sensed Thomas' hesitation because he suddenly burst into laughter, shaking his head. "Thomas, my brother," he clapped him on the back. "You're looking at me like I just offered you a ritual sacrifice." Thomas let out a forced chuckle. "No, it's just, your talk about opportunities was a bit strange." Segun leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms. "Relax, I was just messing with you. You know me, always talking in riddles. It's business talk, nothing serious." Thomas exhaled, nodding slowly. Maybe he was overthinking things. Maybe the years had simply changed them both, and he wasn't used to Segun's new way of speaking. The night stretched on, filled with more drinks and old stories. The bar had thinned out, with only a few customers left, murmuring over half-empty glasses. The bartender wiped down the counter, giving them occasional glances as if silently urging them to leave. Thomas checked his watch, 11:48 p.m. "Ah, it's getting late-o," he said, rubbing his eyes. "Let me start heading home." Segun sighed and glanced at his phone. "Yeah, I should be going too, but there's one small problem." Thomas looked at him. "What problem?" Segun scratched the back of his head and gave an apologetic smile. "I already checked out of my hotel this afternoon since I'm leaving town tomorrow. Didn't think I'd be out this late. I was going to stay at a friend's place, but he's not picking up his phone. I hate to impose, but can I crash at your place for the night?" Thomas hesitated for a moment, but then he shrugged. "Of course, my brother. What are friends for?" Segun grinned. "You're a lifesaver." They left the bar together, stepping into the cool night. The street was quiet, the occasional flicker of a faulty streetlight casting shadows along the pavement. As they walked toward Thomas' house, Segun struck up a conversation. "So your wife, Linda, she's the same one you were dating back in university, right?" Thomas smiled. "Yeso. She stuck with me through everything. I got lucky." Segun chuckled. "A loyal woman. Those are rare these days." They reached Thomas' house, a modest but well-kept duplex with high walls and a metal gate. Thomas unlocked the pedestrian gate and led Segun inside. "My gateman traveled to the village for holiday," Thomas explained. "So it's just me, my wife, the kids, and the house help." They stepped into the quiet house. The living room was dimly lit by the streetlight filtering through the curtains. "Make yourself comfortable," Thomas said, stifling a yawn. "I'll get you a pillow and blanket for the guest room." Segun nodded, looking around. "Nice place. You've done well for yourself." Thomas smiled and headed to the storage room to get the bedding. When he returned, Segun was standing near the family photo frame on the wall, staring at it. "You have beautiful children," Segun said softly. "Thanks," Thomas replied, handing him the blanket. "The guest room is this way." Segun followed him down the hallway. As Thomas opened the door to the guest room, he said, "If you need anything, just let me know. My wife and kids are asleep, and my house help stays in the boys' quarters." Segun nodded. "No worries. Thanks again, my brother." Thomas gave him a tired smile and shut the door behind him before heading to his own room. He found Linda curled up in bed, fast asleep. He quietly changed into his nightwear and slid under the covers. But as he closed his eyes, that uneasy feeling returned. Something about Sagan's presence still didn't sit right with him, and he had no idea that this would be the longest night of his life. Sagun sat on the edge of the bed, his phone pressed to his ear. The dim glow from the bedside lamp cast long shadows across his face, highlighting the wicked smirk curling at his lips. "It's time," he whispered. On the other end, a deep voice responded, "We're outside. No movement yet." Sagun's fingers brushed against the cold metal of the gun in his pocket, and his smile widened. He had done this so many times, yet the thrill never faded. His eyes drifted to the wall, where family photos of Thomas and his wife smiled down at him. It amused him. The victims always thought they were safe, until they weren't. His mind flickered back to his perfected method. Knock them out, inject them, let the drug work its magic, then extract, a slow death. Painless. They had targeted families like Thomas before, upper middle class, comfortable, unaware. Their organs fetched high prices in underground markets, and tonight Thomas had unknowingly led him into a perfect setup. No gateman, a wife and kids sound asleep, a helpless house help tucked away in the boys' quarters. Mike, his assistant, had parked just a few houses away, their tools safely hidden in the trunk. Once the job was done, they would vanish before sunrise, leaving behind nothing but empty beds and unanswered questions. Sagun took a deep breath, gripping the gun tighter. He stood up, stretching lazily, then walked toward the door. It was time to begin. Sagun moved through the dark hallway with slow, deliberate steps. The gun in his hand felt like an extension of his own will, steady, absolute, and final. His fingers grazed the cool metal of the doorknob to the master bedroom, and a sinister smirk crept onto his face. With one forceful push, he flung the door open. "Wake up!" he barked, his voice slicing through the silence like a knife. Thomas and Linda stirred in confusion, their sleepy eyes adjusting to the sight of a tall figure standing over them. At first, Thomas squinted in the dim light, trying to process what was happening. Then he saw the gun, and everything became real. Linda gasped, clutching the blanket to her chest. "Sagun?" Her voice trembled. "Sagun, what is this?" Thomas sat up, his pulse racing. Sagun tilted his head mockingly. "Ah, so now you recognize me. Just a few hours ago we were drinking like brothers." Thomas swallowed hard. "Please, just put the gun down. We can talk." Sagun let out a dry chuckle. "Talk? I don't need to talk. I have a job to do, and I always complete my jobs. You see, I already collected deposits for tonight's delivery." "No turning back now?" Linda broke into soft sobs, pressing herself closer to Thomas. Sagun strolled around the room, admiring the elegant decor. "You people and your comfortable, boring lives. Thinking because you have money and hide behind your high fences, nothing can touch you. You don't know the kind of world that exists beyond your little paradise." Thomas clenched his fists, his mind racing for a way out. "Sagun, we can get you more money. Please, just let us go." Sagun scoffed. "Money? My business makes more than what you could ever offer. You're not the first rich family I've visited." Linda screamed when Sagun suddenly stormed out and returned dragging their two children, Daniel and Tolu, into the room. The little ones were crying, terrified, their tiny hands clutching at their mother. "Mommy!" Linda lunged for them, sobbing uncontrollably. "No, please, they're just children." Sagun smiled darkly. "The children go first. Their organs are fresher." Thomas felt something snap inside him. He could not sit back and watch his family be slaughtered like animals. In a desperate burst of adrenaline, he lunged at Sagun, swinging his arm with all the strength he could muster. A deafening bang filled the room. Thomas crumpled to the ground, clutching his leg, his face contorted in agony. Blood spread across the floor. Linda screamed. The children wailed. But it was that gunshot, the loud, piercing crack in the silent night, that woke Grace in the boys' quarters. The young house help sat upright in bed, her heart pounding. She strained her ears. Was she dreaming? Another muffled cry. No, something was wrong. Barefoot, she tiptoed to the main house, peeking through the slightly open door. Her stomach dropped. Thomas was on the ground, blood pooling around his leg. Linda and the children were huddled together, crying, while Sagun towered over them, gun in hand. Grace covered her mouth to stifle her scream. "Jesus Christ!" Her first instinct was to run for the front gate, but as she turned the corner, she froze. A sleek black car was parked outside, its tinted windows concealing the figures inside. More men. Her breathing hitched. They're not alone. She backed away slowly, her mind racing. If she ran through the front, they would see her. Without wasting another second, she sprinted toward the backyard, her feet barely making a sound. Once hidden behind the water tank, she shakily pulled out her cheap Nokia phone. Her hands trembled as she punched in the emergency number. Hello? Police? Please come fast. Armed men are inside my Oga's house. They are trying to kill them. Her voice was desperate, barely above a whisper. Address? The officer on the other end asked. Grace quickly rattled off the location. Stay hidden. Help is coming. She ended the call and peered through the darkness at the house. Would help arrive in time, or would she be too late? The door creaked open again, and a tall, muscular man with a duffel bag stepped inside. His sharp, calculating eyes flicked around the room before locking onto Sigun. Mike, you're late, Sigun said, his voice laced with irritation. Mike scoffed, dropping the bag on the floor. Traffic. Let's get this done. Linda whimpered as Mike unzipped the bag, revealing neatly arranged syringes, surgical knives, and vials filled with a thick, colorless liquid. Sigun crouched beside Thomas, who lay groaning in pain from his gunshot wound. He grinned, tapping the cold barrel of the gun against Thomas' cheek. You had your chance to cooperate, my friend, Sigun said mockingly. Now you'll just sleep and never wake up. Thomas clenched his teeth, sweat beading on his forehead. He could barely move, but his mind raced, desperate for a miracle. Mike grabbed a syringe, expertly flicking the air bubbles out with his fingers. Let's start with the kids. Smaller bodies, easier to transport. Linda let out a choked scream. No, please! Not my babies. Daniel and Tolu shrank into their mother's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Sigun sighed and looked at Mike. Do it! Just as Mike stepped forward, bang, bang, bang! A thunderous crash echoed through the house as the front door burst open. Police! Drop your weapons! Bright flashlights cut through the darkness, followed by the deafening sound of boots stomping in. Chaos. Mike spun around, reaching for his gun, but a well-aimed shot from an officer shattered the weapon in his grip. He let out a sharp cry as another officer tackled him to the ground, forcing his hands behind his back. Arg! Get off me! Mike snarled, struggling as cold handcuffs snapped around his wrists. Sigun, caught off guard, whipped his gun toward the officers, but before he could pull the trigger, a swift baton strike landed on his wrist, making the weapon fly across the room. Get down, now! A police officer roared. Sigun hesitated for a split second before lunging toward the window in an attempt to escape. Crack! A gunshot rang out. Sigun howled in pain as a bullet grazed his shoulder, sending him crashing to the floor. Officers immediately pounced on him, pinning him down as he thrashed. Let me go, you fools, he screamed, his face contorted with rage. Meanwhile, outside, their getaway driver, who had been waiting in the black car, saw the flashing red and blue lights and fled. The car screeched down the road, disappearing into the night before the officers could catch him. Inside the house, Thomas, Linda, and the children were still trembling, barely processing what had just happened. One officer knelt beside them. You're safe now, he assured them gently. Tears streamed down Linda's face as she clutched her children. Thank you. Oh God, thank you. Another officer called for an ambulance, and within minutes, paramedics arrived. Thomas winced as they carefully lifted him onto a stretcher, bandaging his bleeding leg. Linda and the children were wrapped in blankets, still shaken but unharmed. Outside, as Sigun and Mike were dragged toward the police van, Sigun locked eyes with Thomas one last time. There was no smugness left in him, no arrogance, just cold, bitter defeat. Thomas, despite his pain, mustered a small, victorious smile. Justice had come. The next morning, the air inside the hospital room was calm, but the weight of the previous night still lingered. Thomas lay on the bed, his leg neatly bandaged, while Linda sat beside him, holding his hand tightly. Their children, Daniel and Tolu, were curled up on a separate chair, still shaken but safe. The door creaked open, and a familiar face hesitantly stepped inside. Grace. She looked nervous, unsure if she should enter. She clutched her faded handbag tightly, her small frame still dressed in the simple nightwear she had worn the night before. Her eyes darted around, hesitant to meet Thomas' gaze. Grace. Linda called softly, her voice filled with emotion. Grace bit her lip. Good morning, Ma. She turned to Thomas. Good morning, sir. I just came to check on you. Thomas stared at her for a moment before slowly sitting up, his eyes filled with gratitude softened. Grace, if not for you, my family and I would be dead. Linda nodded, her eyes welling up with tears. You saved us, Grace. You risked your life to call the police. We can never thank you enough. Grace shifted awkwardly. I just did what anyone would have done. No, Thomas said firmly. Not everyone would have had the courage to do what you did. Many people would have run away and left us to die. But you stayed. You called for help. Tolu, still clutching a juice box, suddenly jumped off the chair and ran to Grace, wrapping her little arms around her waist. Thank you, Auntie Grace, she said in her tiny voice. Grace froze for a second before letting out a small, shaky laugh. Oh, my dear, it's okay. She knelt and hugged the child tightly. Linda wiped her tears and stood up. Grace, you're not just our house help, you're family now, Thomas nodded. From today, you'll never have to worry about anything again. We will take care of you the way you took care of us. Grace's eyes widened. Sir, Ma, no, please. I was just doing my job. Thomas shook his head. This is not about a job, Grace. It's about gratitude. It's about knowing that in the worst moment of our lives, you were there. And we will never forget that. Linda stepped forward and pulled Grace into a warm embrace. Grace, overwhelmed, let her tears fall freely. For the first time in her life, she felt truly valued. Outside the hospital, the sun shone brightly, casting away the darkness of the previous night. For Thomas and his family, it was a new beginning. And for Grace, it was the day she became more than just a house help. She became a hero. The end.